Hi lovelies, Lisa here from Mindful Tarot, and today I'd like to bring a video about the Aquarian Tarot, a deck that's been in print pretty much continuously since it first appeared in 1970, and that is widely available in its vintage editions on eBay. And I know that it's widely available because in the past 6 months or so I have just begun to collect these decks. Partly because I love the deck. I mean, the Aquarian Tarot was the second tarot deck I ever owned back in the 80s. My first was the Thoth Tarot, and then was the Aquarian, and it was actually a long time later before I even got just a regular old yellow box Rider-Waite. I don't have that original 1980s version of it. I have no idea where it ended up. But it's a deck that spoke to me early on, just because it's pretty. I like the Art Deco, kind of Art Nouveau, muted palette aesthetic. But I also lost interest in it pretty quickly because it seemed kind of shallow. The imagery seemed less complex. It is less complex than a lot of other decks out there, and certainly even substantially less complex than the Rider-Waite. Which it is a clone of. I mean, it's really echoing the imagery of the Rider-Waite, but very condensed, much more exposure to the faces and the central figures, which consequently means that there's a lot less information in any one card. But of late, I've come back to the deck, and I'm not exactly sure why, and this won't be a deck review, so I'm not going to talk about the imagery so much, but there's something about it, and maybe just something about that sort of 1970s moment that it speaks, that I find compelling. Anyway, so long ago, some gave away, lost, sold, I don't remember, my original 1980s version of the deck. That's the version that has nice cardboard cardstock with the beautiful borderless blue and white backings, and actually the white of all of these vintage versions of the deck, my camera probably won't pick it up, but it's an off-white, it's a subdued white. Anyway, this version of the deck I gave away, lost, whatever, and only recently, like 6 months ago, was I gifted the reprint, what you can buy off Amazon or get at Barnes & Noble, which comes in this glossy tuck box, and very, very characteristically, you can even see the light glinting off it, the reflection. It's a plasticized, traditional U.S. Games version, and now the backs have a border. The coloring is very stark, high contrast, if you can see the difference. And this blue and white back 1980s version is probably a little bit aged by wear, but I am about 100% sure that the off-white was a quality of all of these vintage cardboard decks. Okay, so this is what the deck looks like now, the same size that it's always been, but the plasticky, high gloss, what do you call it? Copyright in the border. This is a nice deck, and actually this deck is, this has barely been used. It wants a home. So first things first, I'd like to do a little giveaway of this modern version of the deck. So if you're interested in owning this, 2016 brand new, barely been touched version of the deck, just list your name below, and in a couple weeks I'll randomly select a winner for this gifted edition of the deck in primo condition, yours just for the low price of nothing, putting your name below. Okay, and I will probably also be doing a giveaway in the future of at least one of my vintage decks, but for now I'm holding on to them. So the publishing history of the Aquarian Tarot, I've been getting very fascinated by how many versions of the deck have seemed to have been emerged since it first was published in 1970. The essentials of the deck, right, the look of the individual cards has remained essentially the same. Okay, they're really, unlike say the Rider-Waite Smith deck, the various other than sort of the cardstock and perhaps the contrast that happens when the cardstock shifts to this plasticized version in the last 15 or so years. Other than that, the coloring really has stayed constant. The detail of the printing has stayed constant. So it's not like the Rider-Waite-Smith deck where, you know, modern versions of it, just the coloring seems off, the printing seems off. Really, this deck has remained very constant. But there have been a lot of different subtle differences in the backing and in the boxes for the deck, and even in the cardstock itself. So let me start with the beginning. This deck comes out initially in 1970 in a black two-piece box. Now, for those of you who are a little bit unfamiliar with terminology, when you hear people talk about tuck boxes, they're talking about these kinds of one-piece boxes that literally have a flap that tuck in. These can be, you know, cheaply made, or they can be beautifully made. So, for instance, the brand new Usi's Pagan Otherworlds tarot deck has a tuck box, but it's a gorgeous, hard, you know, just primo quality tuck box. But typically when people talk about wanting a good high quality box for their tarot deck, they're interested in these kinds of two-piece decks, or even the two-piece boxes or hinge boxes, like the Fountain Tarot's hinge box, where you really feel like you can store the cards in these containers in a permanent way. So the deck comes out in 1970, and it comes out in this black tuck box with the Fool on the front. You will see black tuck two-piece boxes like this from 1970 through the 1980s. So if you're on eBay, just because it's a two-piece box does not mean that it's one of the first editions. The other thing to look at is what's on the back. So this early edition, this is in the first, I think, run in the 1970s, in 1970, maybe 1971. It's Morgan Press Incorporated, Hastings-on-Hudson. That's the first address for the deck. And those first decks come out with a backing in various colors that have this lemniscate Ouroboros. So it's a snake swallowing its tail, but it's in that infinity sign, either in white or in black on a whole palette of colors. So I have this sort of orange color version. These are the first decks. There's pink, there's red, there's black. I'll have a link to a website that lists the full range. I'm currently bidding on one that's pink and white. We'll see, right? As far as I can tell, these decks all have the imagery, these early ones that we're used to seeing in the Aquarian Tarot. Nothing's different. They have numbering at the top. The cardstock is somewhat thin, like a contemporary Llewellyn cardstock. Like actually a nice cardstock. I like that thinner cardstock. It's nice to shuffle. The sides are white, although it seems like the coloring of there's sort of a bleed through. So you might be able to see here, let me just turn off the sound of my computer. You might be able to see here that this is slightly orange on the side because seems like the bleed through. The printing on the backs is a little bit uneven, or at least how it's cut is a little uneven. But by and large, the print quality seems really good, really crisp, and really clean. And this is this version, I think I spent about $48 for this. It's really, these cards are really nice and clean. The box is a little beat to crap, but it's nice and clean in the cards. The little white books for this deck look pretty much the same for the first 15 or so years of its publishing history, but what is on the back will reflect the specific edition. So this is Hastings-on-Hudson. It says 1970. That copyright isn't always to be believed, but sometimes it's accurate. I'll show you what I mean in a second. And then what's on the last page is pretty telling. So available books on the tarot. This very, very early version, notice that it directs you to Sam Weiser's bookstore. And the books that it lists are classics, but they're none of the classics that we associate with the early 1970s. Like this deck came out before a lot of the modern publishing on tarot that we start to see in the 70s. Okay, the next deck in my collection also is a Hastings on Hudson edition. It also says 1970, but I think this is probably, it's a little bit later, maybe 1971. Lists the same, the little white book actually lists the same list of books. The only one that's sort of a more contemporary of all of these are the two by Eden Gray, Tarot Revealed and the Complete Guide to the Tarot. But notice it doesn't, it doesn't list anything like Stuart Kaplan's stuff, or I'll show you some of the others, things that get listed in later decks. The box is the same as the box for the one that had the orange backing. But now the backs of the cards we've shifted into cobalt blue. Interestingly, this Hastings Hudson edition, which I think is 1971, of all the editions that I've gotten, this one does not have numbered trumps. It's weird. Okay, so this is earlier, the orange back does have numbered trumps. This is a little bit later, the blue back doesn't have numbered trumps. The very next edition that I have goes back to numbered trumps. I don't know why. I don't know why that change happened, but it is what it is. So side by side, this is, oops, sorry, that's not helpful. Side by side, right, this is the orange back with the lemniscate, and this is the cobalt black. Both of these early 1970, 71. They look essentially the same. I can't see any discernible difference. The cardstock's really similar. One might be a little bit brighter than the other, but I think that could just easily be the quality of the deck. Sort of how it aged. As it happens, the box, again, I can't tell, sorry. I can't tell from the boxes whether the differences that I'm seeing with the coloring. So this one, which is the one with the blue backing, the coloring seems more vibrant than this one, but that may just be how the box is aged. Okay. The next deck in my collection also has a blue backing, but this one is from 1974, from a moment when Morgan and Morgan, Douglas Morgan, Lloyd Morgan, the two, I think, brothers who created this publishing house. It's the same Morgan from the Morgan Greer Tarot, right? For some reason, and I don't know the history here, so for some reason the decks were being published by Pacific Game Company. So this third deck, I know, is 1974. Again, the little white book is essentially the same little white book that we've been seeing, but now this one doesn't, of all the little white books that I've had, although the text is the same. In the very beginning it says, if you see here, it says, general meanings are included are included here, but for further interpretations of the symbols and their subtler meanings and interrelationships, it is advisable to refer to one or more of the books listed at the end. So all the little white books that come with this deck, and this is even true today, there will be at the end a list of books, but not in this 1974 vintage of the Pacific Games edition. It doesn't list any books at the end, but it has, again, the blue backs. The cardstock is about the same as the cardstock that we've been looking at, and the coloring, the print quality, it's all really the same. I can't really discern any difference in these decks. So we've looked at the lemniscate orange version, the very first editions of the deck. The very next editions, both Hastings and Hudson, New York, Morgan and Morgan, and now this version, 1974. The cardstock has all been the same. The backs either blue or with the color with the infinity snake. And now the very next edition, probably just very shortly after the Pacific Games moment, the deck starts being printed by, now it's not called Morgan & Morgan anymore, it's Morgan Press. So it's still the same Morgan Brothers, still the same deck. The two-piece boxes, pretty much the same. Oh, one small change to note. When the Pacific Games publication happened, the front of the deck starts listing Aquarian Tarot deck as opposed to just a blank. So this mid-1970s moment, it says Aquarian Tarot deck at the bottom. That language disappears later, but in the mid-1970s decks, they seem to say Aquarian Tarot deck on the bottom. So now, 1975-ish, things are happening in Dobbs Ferry. That's where it's no longer Hastings and Hudson. But interestingly, it still says, or maybe not so interestingly, on the box it still says 1970. That copyright doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't really help us. The Little White Book also has 1970 as the copyright, but notice now Morgan Press, Dobbs Ferry, and I think that this version of the deck is what was published in the 1970s. And now the books at the back, we start to see the more modern options of books available on the Aquarian Tarot deck. Tarot and You, The Windows of Tarot, right? So it's not listing as it did in the very, very early editions, these much, much older Tarot of Bohemians, Papuses, the Book of Thoth, right? Now we're reflecting the fact that in the mid-70s, we start to see a whole bunch of publishing happening in America on books on the tarot. Okay. The cardstock also, once it starts being published in Dobbs Ferry, there's a shift in the cardstock, and it gets a little meatier. So, very subtle difference, but I think there's an improvement in the cardstock. So, you know, ironically, I mean, we tend to think about vintage decks. We tend to think, oh, I want the earliest version of it. The cardstock will be the nicest. Actually, with the Aquarian Tarot, if I had to choose, the cardstock that I like the best and the version of the deck that I like the best is not the earliest version. It is, in fact, the version that comes out in the 80s. But before we get there, one last iteration of the deck. So we've been talking about the Morgan Press 1974-75 version of the deck, printed in Dobbs Ferry with the name Aquarian Tarot deck on the bottom of the box. Really nice edition of the deck. My version of it is a little bit beat up, but not bad. There's some chipping. Actually, with all of the cobalt blue backings, there's some chipping. But we're moving from that to what is about the same time, slightly later, so maybe it's 1976, I'm not sure when. Now, this is still Morgan Press, still printed in Dobbs Ferry, but there's no title on the bottom of the box. Still cobalt blue decks, cobalt blue backs on the deck, right? And again, you know, the cardstock is starting with these Dobbs Ferry editions. The cardstock is nicer. The printing quality and the coloring has remained pretty much consistent throughout. I know that these decks, these Dobbs Ferry decks are coming out in around 1975 or so, not because of the copyright listed anywhere, because the copyright says 1970 a lot of places, but because of the information in the White Book that lists the Windows of Tarot and Tarot and You. Tarot and You wasn't published until 1975. As it turns out, my own copy of this, I believe, yes, is this it? This is my nicest vintage edition, I think. It just happens to be really clean and crisp. The colors are really pretty. Just the deck looks like it wasn't used much. It's just in really good shape. But again, with these cobalt blue backings, there's a lot of chipping that just seems to happen, even in a version like this that's so clean and bright. Okay, so we've taken our little journey from the very beginning of the Hastings and Hudson lemniscate backing to up through Dobbs Ferry's mid and late 1970s cobalt blue backings. Again, no writing on the bottom here, although mid 1970s we do have the Aquarian tarot deck emerging on the bottom. Those are the 1970s decks. They're beautiful. You can get them on eBay. Typically, I've been able to get them for, now that I know kind of what I'm looking for and how to suss it out, you know, you can get these for as little as $20 on up to about $50. My favorite edition of this deck, however, remains the 1980s version that has the borderless blue and white backings and has the really nice and chunky cardstock. Again, coloring has remained pretty much the same. And the the two-piece box is pretty much the same two-piece box that we've been seeing all along. Right, here it is. It still lists 1970 and Dobbs Ferry as the place where this is published by Morgan Press, but you can tell from the cards inside that it is a 1980s deck. And indeed, the little white book for this blue and white backing, it's no longer a book, it's a sort of accordion thing, and it will list the Psychic Tarot, companion to the Aquarian Tarot deck, which is a book that was not published until 1985. So if you see a little white book that lists the Psychic Tarot, you know that you're dealing with an 80s deck, even if you can't see in the eBay ad, even if you can't see the backings, that white book will tell you that you have to be in the 1980s or later. And I do recommend this book, The Psychic Tarot, which you can get pretty easily from Abe Books or Amazon. I don't think it's in print anymore. I recommend this book not because necessarily it is the most incredible companion volume ever. It certainly is better on the Aquarian Tarot cards than the little white books ever are, or at least any of the little white books that I've seen. There's a Meteor white book out there that I've seen advertised in eBay, but I haven't ever gotten a copy of it. What's nice about this Aquarian Tarot, what's nice about Craig, I think his name is Junjulas, I could be pronouncing it wrong, Hunhulas, I'm not sure. But what's nice about this book is it really articulates that kind of Aquarian age mentality behind this deck. This is a deck that fundamentally is designed to be read through a kind of depth psychology, intuitive, working with shadow, working with deep sort of archetypal, collective unconscious kind of urgings. So this book really articulates the worldview behind David Palladini's deck. I am going to be looking for copies of both The Windows of Tarot and especially Tarot and You, which was the two books listed in these mid-70s decks. Once I get those copies and get a chance to review them, I'll come back and talk about a little bit more with a deeper review of the Aquarian Tarot, and particularly thinking about the Aquarian Tarot as this tarot that was designed to be one of the first decks, with an interest for self-transformation. So that 1970s moment of the tarot renaissance when people start to discover, yes, whatever the esoteric occult tradition of this deck is, it's also a tool for self-transformation. The Aquarian Tarot was really the first deck that said, let's do this. Let's create a deck for this purpose specifically. Okay, that was a lot of information. I hope it was easy enough to follow. You know, ping me down below if you have any questions. And if you are interested in being the proud owner of this, you know, new, glossy, very serviceable version of the Aquarian Tarot, just mention that below. I will randomly select a winner in a couple weeks. I also imagine, because now it's just a little bit absurd how many versions of this vintage tarot deck I have, that I will be doing in some future time a giveaway of one or more of these vintage editions. But in the meantime, please, please, if you haven't played with this deck yet, let me know if you want it below, and I will send this off to you wherever you may call your home. Okay, mwah. All best to you guys. It's a rainy, drippy day, dark day, sleepy making day in Eugene, Oregon. I am hoping that wherever you are, you're staying dry and safe. And if you're dealing with intense weather, blessings and peace to you.